Hello. Today we are going to cover Genesis chapters 5 and 6 because 5 is genealogies. This chapter follows the lineage of Seth, the son of Adam, just as the last part of chapter 4 presented the lineage of Cain. The chapter ends with the family of Noah, who is going to save humanity through the ark in the next chapter. If we line up the lives of the patriarchs on a timeline, we would learn that Adam to Noah covers 1,656 years. The genealogy is given in order to show the connection between Noah and Seth, the son of Adam. These are not necessarily the firstborn sons of the men listed. Indeed, Seth was not. It is simply showing through whom the line passes from Adam to Noah. We do not know why God saw it appropriate to give the ages of Seth's descendants as opposed to Cain's descendants, nor why the phrase, "and he died," is repeated here in Seth's family in contrast to Cain's. Clearly, it emphasizes the nature of God's warning to Adam and Eve relative to disobedience. Death passed on all men, for all have sinned. Romans 5, verse 12 and verse 14. Let me also introduce a new term, perhaps to you, antediluvian. Ante is a Latin prefix which means before. Diluvian refers to a washing. In biblical context, it refers to the flood of Noah. Therefore, antediluvian refers to the people who lived before the flood. Genesis 1 through 5 are antediluvian history. You read your translation while I read mine. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 5. This is the book of the genealogies of Adam in the day God created mankind. In his image God made him. The word book here is a self-contained source of information. We do not know if this book was self-contained when it arrived in the hands of Moses, or if Moses uses the word in a generic way to mean some story or history or information or something similar. The word genealogies is used for the second time. The first referred to the genealogies of the heavens and the earth, back in chapter 2 and verse 4. This genealogy simply records the life of Adam and his descendants through Seth until Noah, where the next genealogy picks up in chapter 6 and verse 9. We translate the first Adam with the proper name Adam, since Moses is giving Adam's lineage. But we translate the second Adam as mankind, in the generic sense, because all mankind came from Adam and Eve. And verse 2 points this out. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and called their name man in the day of their creating. So God made male and female. They are both man in the generic sense of mankind, and God called their name man. We also observe here that the word create, bara, and the word made, asa, are synonyms. Luke will trace the genealogy through Shem and Noah of Jesus Christ, all the way back through Seth and Adam, who was the Son of God. Luke chapter 3, verses 36 through 38. Verses 3 through 5. When Adam lived 130 years, then there was born to him in his image, as his likeness, and he called his name Seth. Image and likeness are the same two words in which man in general was created back in chapter 1 and verse 26. So isn't it fascinating that humans have the ability to create in our image and our likeness in the same way that God created humanity in his image and his likeness? Verse 4. So the days of Adam were, after there was born to him Seth, 800 years, and there was born sons and daughters. And all the days of Adam which he lived were 930 years, and he died. The ages of these patriarchs are hard to accept by some people. Since other ancient Near Eastern literature has even more advanced ages, others think these numbers are somehow symbolic. Before the flood, among the king list in Sumer, the king's reigns ranged from 18,600 years to 43,200 years. And yet there are two factors to keep in mind when considering these ages of the patriarchs. First, we live in a world that is created and governed by an all-powerful God, Genesis 1 and verse 1. If he wished for men to live 500 to 900 years, it was certainly possible. Secondly, considering the changes that occurred during the flood of Noah's day, it is entirely possible that genetic deviations were not occurring before the flood, so that the whole aging process was considerably slower than it is today. The image and likeness of which Adam bore Seth is the same words, if not the same idea as God's creation of man in chapter 1 and verse 26. Certainly Seth would bear physical likeness to his earthly father as humans bear a spiritual resemblance to our spiritual father. Since Adam's son Seth was after Adam's image and likeness, Adam, being made in the image and likeness of God, could be considered a son of God. And that is how Luke interprets the relationship in Luke chapter 3 and verse 38. I am reading verses 6 through 17. Seth lived 105 years, and there was born Enosh. Then Seth was, after there was born Enosh, 807 years, and there was born sons and daughters. And all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And Enosh lived 90 years, and there was born Cainan. And Enosh was, after there was born Cainan, 815 years, and there was born sons and daughters. And all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. And Cainan lived 70 years, and there was born Mahalalel. Then Cainan was, after there was born Mahalalel, 840 years, and there was born sons and daughters. And all the days of Cainan were 910 years, and he died. And Mahalalel lived 65 years, and there was born Jared. Then Mahalalel was, after he was born Jared, 830 years, and there was born sons and daughters. And all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. Now verses 18 through 27. Jared lived 162 years, and there was born Enoch. Then Jared was, after there was born Enoch, 800 years, and there was born sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. And Enoch lived 65 years, and there was born Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God, after there was born Methuselah, 300 years, and there was born sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and was not, since God took him. Enoch was not is a phrase used to refer to death in other passages. But in this context, we are being told that Enoch did not die. The phrase is said in contrast to, and he died, and it is contrasted also with, since God took him. Verse 25. Then Methuselah lived 187 years, and there was born Lamech. Then Methuselah was, after there was born Lamech, 782 years, and there was born sons and daughters. And all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. For those who like to find symbolism in every nook and cranny, Enoch's 365 years reflect the 365 days in a solar year. Somehow that is supposed to be a reflection of a complete life. We prefer to see the 365 years as reflecting reality, just as the other ages reflect reality and are not symbolic. If we are able to understand these lifespans in a chronological way, then Methuselah died the year the flood came, if not in the flood. He lived an extremely long time and saw many children and more generations come and go. It is interesting that the man who had the shortest lifespan in this chapter, Enoch, had the son who lived the longest lifespan. Enoch walked with God. That was his manner of life, the cumulative choices he made on a daily basis. There is implied in that statement that God communicated in some way his expectations of Enoch, and Enoch met those expectations. We are not suggesting that Enoch was sinless, but God chose to take Enoch straight to heaven for a reason. Perhaps it was a great blessing on Enoch because he lived a godly life in an ungodly environment. Jude verses 14 and 15. Perhaps it was to show later generations that death was not going to touch every single person, as the text suggests. Indeed, Elijah in 2 Kings chapter 2 will not taste death either, and there will be some alive when the Son of Man returns, so that they will not taste death. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 17. It seems clear to us from this text, and we believe it would have been clear to Moses' contemporaries, that there is life after death. Stories of Enoch will grow up and inspire later generations of Jews, so much so that 3 literary works in the years between the Old Testament and the New Testament will be called after Enoch. The New Testament writers will not treat any of those works as written with the aid of the Holy Spirit of God. Just as Enoch walked with God, so Noah is said to have walked with God, Genesis 6 and verse 9. Jehovah God will call on Abraham to walk before him and be perfect, Genesis 17 and verse 1. Abraham will summarize his life as walking with Jehovah, chapter 24 and verse 20. And Jacob will, on his deathbed, comment that both Abraham and Isaac walked before God. Later writers will also challenge Israel to walk with God. The prophets call on Israel to walk before God, walking in his paths. I referred to Jude verses 14 and 15. He informs us that Enoch was the 7th from Adam, which is consistent with Genesis chapter 5, and that he preached the coming judgment of God. It sounds like Enoch was on Noah's side, and trying to get their violent contemporaries to change their behavior. Enoch had no success. The flood was the next step in God's plans. The Hebrew writer holds up Enoch as an example of faith by which he pleased God, Hebrews 11 and verse 5. Now let's read verses 28 through 32. And Lamech lived 182 years, and there was born a son. Then he called his name Noah, saying, This one will bring us rest from our work and from our drudgery of our hands from the land which God cursed. The name Noah is a play on the verb to bring rest. The verb is found 108 times. Verse 30. Then Lamech lived after was born Noah, 595 years, and there was born sons and daughters. And all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. And Noah was the son of the 500 years, and there was born for Noah Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We translate son of literally in verse 32. It is an idiom in Hebrew to express the possession of a quality. A Noah will be mentioned by name 58 times in the Bible. We would have to create a chart to compare the lives and date of deaths of the patriarchs to get a view of the big picture. In doing so, we would learn that, taking the genealogy seriously, Noah is the first individual born after the death of Adam. In some way, we do not know how, Lamech thought Noah would bring rest from the curse God set on the land due to Adam's disobedience. Verse 29 recalls that curse from Genesis 3, verses 16 and 17. Now referring to Noah being mentioned 58 times in the Bible, most of those references are to this Noah. But there was an Israelite by the name of Zelophehad who had a daughter by the name of Noah. Noah is mentioned by name by Isaiah and Ezekiel, which argues for his historicity. Noah will take center stage in the history of mankind in the next 3 chapters of Genesis. So let's take a few moments to look at Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6 introduces God's punishment on sin at the worldwide level. 4 chapters are dedicated to the sin and the cure. Chapter 6, the flood itself, the debarkation from the ark, and the renewing of God's command to mankind through Noah to be fruitful and multiply. Abel's blood cried out to God from the earth, Genesis 4 and verse 10, and wickedness and violence was praised by Lamech in chapter 4, verses 23 and 24. And now, wickedness and violence fill the earth. The universal destruction caused by the flood will serve as an archetype for the universal destruction to be caused by fire when the Son of Man returns, 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 through 12. Let's read verses 1 through 4. It happened that the man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. The verb to multiply is also the verb used in God's command in chapter 1 and verse 28. The word beautiful in verse 2 is the feminine form of the word good, that was seen back in chapter 1. The sons of God saw the daughters of man, that beautiful they were, and they took to themselves wives from all whom they chose. And then Jehovah said, My spirit will not plead with man indefinitely, since he is flesh, and his days will be 120 years. The word spirit is the same word used of God's Spirit in chapter 1 and verse 2. To plead is found only here in biblical literature, one single time, which is a concept called in the Latin language hapex legomenon, which means it's found only once. The word I've translated indefinitely in verse 3 is the same word as from of old in verse 4, which is often translated eternal, but the word means indefinite. Verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they knew them. These were the warriors from of old, who were men of reputation. God wanted mankind to multiply, chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, and here he was doing so. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful. The Hebrew word is good. And so the men married the women, whom they chose. There are three views on who the sons of God are. First, some type of heavenly being, generally suggested to be angels. The expression seems to refer to angels in other passages. Secondly, a few have thought the phrase refers to royalty or dynastic rulers, primarily Jews from the 2nd century AD, because the word for gods in Hebrew can be used in the sense of divine, as in some passages. This interpretation was perhaps under the influence of Christian theology relative to the nature of beings in the spirit world. Kings are called sons of God in passages like 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 14 and Psalms 2 verse 7. In this case you would have aristocrats marrying lower class people. The third option, many years after the establishment of Christianity, Christians began viewing the phrase as a reference to the descendants of Seth. In that view, the daughters of men would refer to the family of Cain, in which case we have good people marrying the lineage of bad people. We simply cannot accept option number 1. Although it was the primary view of the Jews in the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the primary view of scholars today. Marriages between gods and men are a well-known component of pagan literature. And yet Jesus clearly says that angels do not marry in Matthew 22 verses 29 and 30. Additionally, beings in the spirit world do not have flesh and blood, Luke 24 verse 39. And so it is hard to imagine that angels could engage in the sexual relationship. Plus, the flood was to punish mankind, not angelic beings. We would also reject this idea because angels are not in the context, nor anywhere near the context. In fact, Moses had a word for angels, malach, which he uses 17 times in Genesis, 15 times of which it's translated angel, and he could have used it here if he had wanted to do so. And then finally, our brother Burton Kaufman makes a keen observation. Holy angels would not have induced men to sin, and fallen angels in a million years would never have been designated by the Holy Spirit as the sons of God. We draw your attention back to the nature of our literal translation of chapter 5 and verse 32, that Noah is referred to by the Hebrew idiom as a son of 500 years. And then a few verses later, we have the men referred to as sons of God. Just as the idiom refers to Noah having the quality of being 500 years old, this line of Seth has the quality of being followers of God, or godly people. To contrast their nature with the nature of Cain's line, the opposite of sons is daughters, and the opposite of God is men. And so the sons of God seems to refer to Seth's godly descendants, while the daughters of men refers to Cain's descendants. That seems the most likely understanding in the context of Genesis chapters 5 and 6, the book of Genesis as a work for Moses' audience, and in the context of biblical theology. Chapter 5 had focused on the lineage of Seth, from father to son. The emphasis was on the sons. But chapter 6 verse 1 tells us that man also had daughters. Jesus said that men and women were marrying and being given in marriage when the flood came, Matthew 24, verses 38 and 39. Finally, there's absolutely no reason to assume that Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, and 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4, or Jude, verse 6, is referring to this event when they speak of the fall of angels. That is poor hermeneutics. Additionally, it's not clear at all that the expression sons of God in Psalms 82 and verse 6 and Daniel chapter 3 are referring to angels. We reject option number 2 on the simple basis that it is foreign to the context of Genesis 6, and really the whole book. Nowhere else in biblical teaching is it sinful for royalty to marry lower class people. This brings us back to the line of Seth marrying the line of Cain. God's Spirit was involved in the creation, chapter 1 and verse 3. At this point, God has decided that the Spirit will withdraw from man. The Holy Spirit will withdraw from others later in biblical history, such as King Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 4. When this happens, either of two things will result. Man's lifespan will be limited to 120 years, or mankind will have 120 years to listen to the Spirit through inspired spokesmen and repent of their sins before the worldwide catastrophe overtakes it. It does not seem accurate to take option number 1, since many men live past 120 years throughout the book of Genesis. The latter option seems to fit the evidence more accurately. Relative to the Nephilim, a word which is only found elsewhere in Numbers 13 and verse 33, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, translates the word gigantes, a word used to describe the mix of gods and man. Without further knowledge of the Hebrew word Nephilim, it is better to leave it untranslated and acknowledge we do not know much of anything about them. For other passages on the idea of giants in the biblical times, see Deuteronomy chapter 2 and chapter 3. Since Moses is writing for the generation who experienced the events recorded in Numbers chapter 13, it seems best to understand Moses to be using Nephilim in a generic sense, telling Israel that those type of people existed before the flood. They were destroyed by God in the flood, and so there was no reason for this generation to be afraid of them. Of course, that generation of Israel did not trust Genesis chapter 6. They did not listen to Moses, and they rebelled against God and paid the price. The story is told in chapters 13 and 14 of Numbers. It is always better to choose a spouse based on whom God would choose for us, rather than simply on the basis of exterior appearances. God, through Moses, will require the sons of Israel to marry fellow believers, Deuteronomy chapter 7. But again, they will not learn from Genesis 6, nor will they listen to Moses, and they will pay the price. King Solomon will marry many foreign women who will lead his heart away from God. And we have another son of God who marries daughters of men and suffers the consequences. Unfortunately, the sons or daughters of God are still marrying the daughters or sons of men and being led away from God. Too many Christians are ignoring the lesson to be learned from Genesis 6, 1 through 4. While the New Testament teaches that angels fell from God's grace, Jude verse 6 and 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4, there is no reason to believe either writer is referring to this event. Verses 5 through 8. Then Jehovah saw that great was evil of man on the earth, and every thought of the plans of his heart were only evil all the day. The word evil does not always mean evil in the moral or spiritual sense. It can mean something of little worth or a calamity. The word heart is a literal translation, although we would associate thoughts with the mind rather than the heart. And yet it is true that emotions are often a part of our decisions. Verse 6. Then Jehovah grieved that he made man on the earth, and it pained his heart. The word grieved in verse 6 is the same word used of Lamech's thoughts regarding Noah back in chapter 5, verse 29. It is unfortunate that older versions, like the King James Version, translate the word repent, since the Bible clearly teaches that God does not have to modify his behavior based on external circumstances, Numbers 23 verse 19, and 1 Samuel 15 and verse 29. Verse 7. So Jehovah said, Let me wipe out man whom I created from on the face of the land, from man to the wild animal, to the creeping thing, and to the bird of the heavens, because I am grieved that I made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of Jehovah. Grace is used 69 times in the Old Testament, and it means grace or favor or charm. The Hebrew word also gives us the woman's names Hannah or Anna. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 20 and 21, Peter uses the flood as a metaphor for immersion in water for the forgiveness of sins, a concept pictured as being washed or having sins wiped out by the blood of Christ. Ephesians 5, 26 and 27. The emphasis in this passage is on the evil of man. It was so bad that his thoughts were entirely evil. It grieved God and pained God in his heart that he had made man. We do not believe God being grieved conveys any sense of surprise or regret that he had made man, as if he had made a mistake. It is entirely possible to be all-knowing and still feel intense emotions. Think of your favorite movie, which you may have seen dozens of times, but yet you still laugh or cry at particular points. God knew man would sin against him, and he would have to punish mankind, just as he knew he would punish his son on the cross. But he still felt intense sorrow over that punishment. Lamech had expressed hope that Noah would bring rest. He did, but not as Lamech could have imagined. Noah brought rest in the sense that he lived an obedient life before God, received the instructions to build the ark, built it, and saved the world from the destructive waters of the flood. The word earth is used 8 times in verses 5 through 13. Additionally, the word translated every or all is used 63 times in the flood account, chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. We do not know how much clearer Moses could have been to tell us the flood was worldwide. Consider the verses that I have on the screen. It simply astounds us that anyone who would take either the Bible or science seriously does not see evidence of a worldwide watery cataclysm everywhere. I invite you to do research on the flood of Noah at apologeticspress.org. Verses 9 through 12. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. Complete he was in his generation. With God, Noah walked. The first word, generations, is different from the second word, generation. The first word is the one used in chapter 2, verse 4, and chapter 5, verse 1, and chapter 6, verse 9, which indicates natural divisions in the text or a history of Genesis. The word righteous means righteous, just, or innocent. It refers to a person living up to God's expectations as much as humanly possible. As such, it can be translated godly. The word complete means blameless, complete, finished, or perfect. It is frequently used to refer to animals for sacrifice which were perfect specimens. Since the phrase with God is thrown to the beginning of the clause, it emphasizes Noah's relationship with God. With God, Noah walked. Verse 10. And Noah fathered 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth was corrupt before the face of God, and the earth was filled with violence. Then God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupted, because all flesh had corrupted its way on the earth. Notice that the word earth is mentioned 5 times in verses 11 through 13, while the word corrupted is also found 5 times. The word righteous in chapter 6, verse 9 is the first occurrence of this key biblical word in the text of God's Word. So important is the word that it runs throughout the whole Old and New Testaments. The last occurrence is in Revelation 22, verse 11, where it's used twice. This is also the first time the word complete is found in the Bible. God describes Noah as righteous in chapter 7 and verse 1. To be righteous is to live up to God's expectations as much as humanly possible. In the same way, the word complete means faithfulness to God's requirements. The word complete will later be used for perfect specimens used in sacrifices. Noah walked with God, just as Enoch had done, chapter 5, 22 through 24. It is possible to walk with God in the midst of a sinful, wicked, perverted, violent generation of people. Man had been commanded to fill the earth in chapter 1, verses 22 and 28, and they did. They filled the earth with violence. The earth was corrupt. God saw it, and behold, it was corrupt. Back in chapter 1 and verse 31, God had seen everything He had made and said it was good. And now He sees it as corrupt. All flesh had corrupted its way on the earth. We have seen that Enoch preached to his generation, Jude verse 14, and Noah preached to his generation, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5. Man should have humbled himself, repented at God's messengers, and been saved from destruction. But in the middle of millions of people, it was too easy to ignore the threat of destruction and continue living as if there was no God. Verses 13 through 22. So God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come to my face, because the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, they are corrupting the earth. Make yourself an ark of trees of gopher. Cubicles you will make in the ark, and you will cover it inside and outside with pitch." The word ark is only used one other time besides this context. Exodus chapter 2, verse 3. It is an Egyptian loan word, a subtle defense of Moses' authorship, since he grew up in Egypt and was educated in all their ways, Acts 7 and verse 22. The word gopher is simply a transliteration of the Hebrew word. It is not found elsewhere, so scholars don't know what type of wood it was. Most guess it was cypress. And so it is the word ark that is an Egyptian word, not the word gopher, as I have on the screen. The word cubicles is usually translated nest. It suggests small compartments inside the ark. The word cover and pitch are from the same word, to cover. The verb will later be translated to atone or cover sins. Verse 15. And this is what you will make it: 300 cubits the length of the ark, 50 cubits its breadth, and 30 cubits its height. A window you will make for the ark, and to a cubit you will finish it upwards, and a door for the ark on its side. You will put lower, second, and third levels, you will make it. The word window here is a different word from the word referring to the same object in chapter 8 and verse 6. The word window here is not found anywhere else in the Bible. Verse 17. Then I myself, behold, am bringing the flood of waters on the earth to destroy all flesh which is on it, the spirit of life from under the heavens. All which is on the earth will perish. The word for flood here is found only here in the context of Noah's flood, and later in Psalms 29 and verse 10. Apparently it was a term that was uniquely suited for this catastrophic event. The verb to destroy in verse 17 was translated as corrupt in chapter 6 verses 11 through 13. There we translated it with moral and spiritual overtones. Here it carries its more literal meaning. Verse 18. I will establish my covenant with you, and you will come to the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. The word covenant can mean a pact, contract, commitment, pledge, promise, or, if between nations, a treaty. It is also an important biblical concept. It is used 27 times in the book of Genesis, with 8 occurrences being in chapters 6 through 9 relative to Noah. Verse 19. And from all life, from all flesh, too, from all you will bring to the ark to preserve with you male and female they will be. From the bird after their kind, and from the wild animal after their kind, and from every creeping thing on the earth after their kind, too, from all will come to you to be preserved. Even you take for yourself from all food which will be eaten you, and will store for yourself, and it will be for you and for them for food. And Noah did according to all which God commanded him. Thus he did. Verse 13 emphasizes again how the earth had corrupted itself before the eyes of God, immersed in sin. Sin requires punishment from a holy God who cannot look with approval on sin, Habakkuk 1 and verse 13. God commands Noah to build an ark, a very large rectangular box in order to escape the destruction God is bringing on the earth. We did not know what type of wood gopher was. Most guessed it was cypress. It would be buoyant in water. Pitch was bitumen, which was waterproof. The cubicles were probably smaller rooms inside the ark to separate animals, as well as rooms for the humans, food, and perhaps waste products. A cubit is the length from the elbow to the tip of the tallest finger, 18 inches. The size of the ark would give an area around 95,700 square feet. By contrast, an American football field is about 57,000 square feet. Remember, the ark had 3 levels. The cargo capacity would be over 15,000 tons. We've not commented on ancient Near Eastern parallels to the flood and Noah's Ark. The parallels are found all over the world, more than any other biblical parallels, and yet they all show evidence of human embellishment. Just for one example, the boat built by Utnapishtim in the Babylonian epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was a perfect cube, completely unworthy of sea voyage in any form. Noah's Ark was very large, but it was a rectangular box. It was not designed to move as much as it was designed to float, to keep Noah, his family, and the animals safe. The window seems to be an opening around the entire ark, 1 cubit below the roof, although the text is not entirely clear. There is one door, which God himself in his time will close. Chapter 7, verse 16. Verse 17 begins with the emphatic pronoun I myself, showing that God is behind the flood from beginning to end. It is his form of punishment and discipline for a world that has corrupted itself. God is the one who gave life, chapter 2, verse 7, and he is now the one extinguishing life, chapter 6, verse 17. God's covenant to save the world through Noah's obedience in building the ark and fulfilling God's other commands. The implication is that Noah must obey in order to be a party to the covenant. The fact that God saves Noah, his sons, and their wives is emphasized throughout the text, and this shows the grace of God relative to Noah, but also to mankind in general. He does not destroy all of mankind. 8 souls were saved by God's choice in the ark. The number of animals is only given in general terms here. As Moses did with chapters 1 and 2, he will give the general terms in chapter 6 and then get more specific in chapter 7. Enough food for the humans and the animals were taken on the ark with all the animals which God selected to be saved, being brought apparently by God's providence. It is interesting that Noah does not speak at all in chapters 6 through 9. God speaks. Through these chapters we have noted 10 references to God speaking, most of the time to Noah, and Noah obeys. We also do not have to assume that Noah and his 3 sons or their wives were the sole workers on the ark. Other family members or friends or even hired people could have helped them build the ark, even if they did not believe the message of the preacher. 8 souls, in the midst of perhaps millions, obeyed and were saved. The Israelites built the tabernacle to God's specifications in Exodus chapter 39 in terms that are reminiscent of Noah's obedience. The word covenant is certainly a key word through the rest of the Old Testament. And again, I remind you that both Isaiah and Ezekiel will refer to Noah as a historical person. When it comes to the New Testament, the flood of Noah is used as an illustration of sudden but certain destruction by Jesus. Noah built the ark, obeyed by faith, Hebrews 11 and verse 7. Peter will refer to Noah several times. The salvation of Noah through the ark is a picture of salvation from sins through the waters of baptism, 1 Peter chapter 3, 20 and 21. Noah was a herald of righteousness, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5. And in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, Peter uses the universal, complete, and certain destruction of the flood, destruction of the world, through the flood, to assure us that God will destroy the world in its entirety, one day, completely, and for sure. Thank you for joining us in our Bible study today. May God bless you. Go with God.